The town of Beau Rêve, Louisiana, was suddenly ripped from its slumber. That morning, a piece of news struck the hearts of its residents like a lightning bolt from a clear blue sky. In a series of catfish ponds on the Plumbon Parish outskirts, 39 bodies of women had been found, stacked at the muddy bottom. The news spread like wildfire, from whispered conversations on front porches to the glaring screens of 24-hour news channels. People crowded the parish roads, some running toward the scene, others frozen on their doorsteps, unable to speak. The catfish farm had long been known as the livelihood of one Pops Morrow, a hardworking, middle-aged man who was a fixture in the community. No one could have imagined that the place that provided sustenance for so many held a tomb of the dead. As the news broke, the townspeople swarmed. They couldn't believe what their ears were telling them, but a morbid curiosity pulled their feet forward. That morning, the rhythm of the small town ground to a halt. The cotton fields, usually alive with the hum of machinery, were silent. The dusty roads, normally filled with children chasing after stray dogs, were empty. All eyes were fixed on one point, the large pond in the center of the farm, now encircled by yellow police tape. A putrid smell, thick and cloying, hung in the humid air, detectable even from a distance. Pale faces stared with a mixture of horror and fascination. A woman clutched a handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. She whispered that it couldn't be possible, not that many bodies in one place. Beside her, an old man leaned heavily on his cane, his hand trembling as he muttered prayers under his breath. A few of the younger men from town, who had tried to help the first responders, were now sitting on the ground, their faces ashen after witnessing the bodies being lifted, one by one, from the murky sludge. When the black body bags were brought to the edge of the pond, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Long hair matted with mud, tattered clothing clinging to waterlogged frames, skin a pale, bruised blue, the bodies had been piled on top of each other. Some were still bound with rope, others had nearly decomposed into the thick, sucking mud. It wasn't one, not two, but 39. The scene erupted into chaos. Some immediately suspected a dark ritual, some kind of voodoo or black magic. Others were certain it was the work of a serial killer. But everyone agreed on one thing: this was an abomination. The parish sheriff, Leland Dubois, arrived quickly, his face a mask of controlled tension. He tried to calm the residents, his voice booming as he asked everyone to leave the matter to the authorities. But his words were drowned out by sobs and hysterical screams. Local news crews began to arrive, their cameras panning across the panicked faces, recording every step the deputies took. Within hours, the story was a national headline, a chilling banner crawling across television screens from coast to coast: 39 female bodies found in Louisiana catfish pond. At the edge of the pond, Caleb Boudreau, the young farmhand who first found the piece of cloth snagged on a PVC pipe, still sat in a stupor. His face was devoid of color, his body racked with tremors. The image of the bloated, blue arm he had pulled from the water danced relentlessly in his mind. He tried to erase it, but the more he fought it, the more vivid it became. Meanwhile, sheriff's deputies were busy reinforcing the yellow tape, yelling at anyone who got too close. A young forensics expert, barely out of college, said in a low tone that the number of victims was too high for a small town like this. This wasn't just a crime, it was something far bigger, something monstrous lurking beneath the surface of their quiet lives. The crowd huddled at a distance, their whispers weaving a tapestry of fear. Some recalled old tales of people who got rich quick, rumors of deals made with the devil at a crossroads. Others stared at Pops Morrow's small farmhouse with suspicion. How could the ponds he tended with such care turn out to be a mass grave? Yet, others defended him, saying it was impossible that such a generous, church-going man could be capable of such evil. That day, Beau Rêve changed. It was no longer a peaceful town nestled among bayous and cotton fields, but a place steeped in fear. Children were forbidden from playing outside, doors were locked tight, even in the middle of the day. People spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid an unseen ear was listening. The shadow of death hung over the rooftops, and the foul stench from the direction of the pond served as a constant, nauseating reminder that the tragedy was real. Behind the crowd, a journalist scribbled furiously in his notebook. He knew the story would be his big break, but even he couldn't suppress the chill running down his spine. How could 39 women end up at the bottom of a place that was supposed to be a fish pond? That question echoed in everyone's mind, but no one had an answer. That night, the darkness that fell over the town felt heavier than usual. The sound of Zydeco music from the local radio station was absent. There was no laughter spilling out from the dimly lit diner. Only the shrill chorus of cicadas and bullfrogs, a sound that now seemed like a mournful dirge, a silent witness to the tragedy. The people of Beau Rêve went to bed with restless hearts, not knowing what tomorrow would bring. But one thing was certain: since that horrific discovery, their town would never be the same again. As evening bled into night, the atmosphere in the town grew heavier still. From the small white-steepled church at the edge of the road, the evening bell chimed, but unlike most nights, very few cars pulled into the gravel lot for prayer meeting. Most residents chose to stay home, bolting their doors and drawing their curtains. Mothers turned on every light in the house, afraid the darkness would bring with it a sense of foreboding. Young children asked innocently why everyone was crying, but their parents could only stroke their hair, offering no answers. Caleb Boudreau couldn't sleep. The image of the dark, sodden cloth he'd pulled from the pond was seared into his memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bluish human arm, felt its unnatural weight as if it were touching his own skin. His breath came in ragged gasps, a tight band squeezing his chest. He stumbled out of his small trailer, sitting on the rickety wooden steps and staring up at the starless sky. The air, thick with humidity, felt cold against his skin. In the distance, the yellow police tape encircling Pops Morrow's catfish farm was illuminated by the harsh glare of portable floodlights, making the pond look like a black maw that swallowed the light. The few people who had to drive past that section of road sped up, refusing to glance in its direction. For them, that place was no longer a landmark of local industry, but a cursed gravesite holding a terrible secret. At the town hall, a few community leaders had gathered in secret. They prayed together, asking for protection, for deliverance from a greater calamity. But in the quiet corners of their minds, a question they dared not speak aloud took root: who could have done this, and why in their town? That night, Beau Rêve was utterly silent. There was only the sound of the wind rustling through the Spanish moss and the occasional, mournful howl of a distant dog. But behind that silence, everyone knew a bitter truth. Their lives had been irrevocably altered. Since those 39 bodies were pulled from the bottom of the pond, the peace of their town had been buried along with them in the foul, clinging mud. For as long as anyone could remember, Beau Rêve, a speck on the map deep in the Louisiana parish of Plumbon, had been defined by its tranquility. Long before the news of dozens of bodies shook its foundations, life there moved at a gentle, unhurried pace, governed by the seasons and a deep sense of community. The mornings began with a cool mist rolling off the bayou, mixing with the scent of damp earth from the freshly irrigated cotton fields. The crowing of roosters was a natural alarm clock, a chorus accompanied by the lowing of cattle in their weathered wooden pens. The people of Beau Rêve believed that morning was a blessing, a time when God scattered fortune upon the land. Children ran barefoot on the dirt paths that crisscrossed the small settlement, flying kites made from newspaper or dueling with sticks fashioned into imaginary swords. Their laughter was a bright, clean sound against the backdrop of the rising sun. In kitchens filled with the aroma of chicory coffee and frying bacon, mothers prepared breakfast. Some cooked grits, while others fried up fresh catfish caught from the local waterways. Meanwhile, the men walked toward the fields, tools slung over their shoulders, many with hand-rolled cigarettes dangling from their lips, a constant companion to a hard day's work. In the afternoons, the town was just as picturesque. Children coming home from the small parish school would sit on porch steps, sharing simple snacks, often just a boiled sweet potato or a piece of cornbread. The young men would gather in a dusty field near the town hall for a game of baseball, their cheers and shouts echoing through the humid air, making the town feel alive and full of spirit, even with a battered ball and makeshift bases. The Beau Rêve Town Hall was always the hub of activity. It was where people gathered for town meetings, potlucks, or simply to sit on the porch and swap stories over a glass of sweet tea. Mayor Leland Du Bois was a frequent presence, always ready with a friendly greeting, asking after everyone's family by name. He was known for his easy smile and his willingness to help a family struggling to pay a medical bill. Many called him the town father, as if he were truly a patriarch to them all. The town also held fast to its traditions. Every Sunday, the sound of gospel hymns spilled from the doors of the little white church. Families gathered in the pews, singing and praying for their ancestors. Children sat fidgeting beside their parents, learning the words to the old songs. After the service, there was always a shared meal on the church grounds, with tables laden with fried chicken, potato salad, and pecan pie. These moments of togetherness made everyone feel like one large, extended family. Not much had changed in Beau Rêve for decades. The paths remained unpaved, save for a small stretch of asphalt downtown. The fields stretched out vast and green during the growing season, turning a dusty brown after the harvest. The residents lived off the land, farming, raising livestock, or running small local businesses. Life moved slowly, filled with a quiet patience, as if time itself had decided to linger so they wouldn't lose their sense of peace. Yet, amidst all this serenity, one place had always been a focal point of pride: Pops Moreau's catfish farm. The large, well-tended ponds were a testament to his hard work. Many of the town's young men found their first jobs there, helping to feed the fish or drain the ponds. Moreau was known to be generous, often paying more than the agreed-upon wage just to give the boys a bit of encouragement. He was also fond of dispensing simple, homespun advice. "A catfish is a patient creature," he'd say. "Lives in muddy water, but it survives, even when its world ain't perfect." If a man could learn from a catfish, he'd be a whole lot stronger. That advice was remembered by the townspeople, repeated at the local diner as if it were a guiding prayer. Everyone believed that Beau Rêve would be peaceful forever. No one suspected that behind the catfish ponds, a place filled with such sage advice, lay a horrifying secret that would one day change the fate of every resident. At the time, no one was prepared to face the truth. They lived their routines, working, laughing, and praying as they always had. Those peaceful days are now only a bitter memory. Whenever the residents look at their fields or sit at the town hall, they remember how quiet life was before the truth was dredged up. The peace they had cherished was torn to shreds, replaced by fear and suspicion, as if the slow-moving town had been struck by a hurricane that leveled everything in its path. But for a patient listener, remembering the peaceful face of Beau Rêve is a valuable reminder that life can be shattered in an instant, and that true tranquility doesn't always mean safety. Because beneath the stillest waters, there can be a dark, deadly current. Pops Moreau was one of the most respected names in Beau Rêve. Besides the mayor, the middle-aged man was known for being diligent, resilient, and humble. His hair was starting to gray at the temples, his skin tanned and leathery from years under the Louisiana sun, but a friendly smile was always on his face. Everyone who met him was greeted with a warm, "Hey now," as if he always had time to listen to their troubles. The catfish farm he built was not an overnight success. Decades ago, when he was in his 30s, he decided to try fish farming on a piece of land inherited from his parents. The plot was small, just a little patch of swampland not suitable for growing crops. Patiently, he dug out the earth himself, creating a simple pond with clay walls reinforced with cypress logs. He started with just a few hundred catfish fingerlings. The initial yields were modest, but his spirit never wavered. He was known for his refusal to give up. Every time a harvest failed, he would try again with a new method. One season, all his fish died because the water became stagnant and toxic. But instead of despairing, he learned how to build a simple circulation system from old PVC pipes to keep the water moving. From there, his ponds began to thrive. Little by little, his income grew. With the money from his harvests, he bought adjacent plots of land, digging more ponds. Now, he had over 10 large ones. The townspeople saw him as a role model. He not only built his own business, but also created jobs for the young men of the town. Many local boys who didn't finish high school could still earn a decent wage helping out at the farm. Some hauled sacks of feed, others cleaned out the mud, and a few worked as night watchmen. Pops Moreau was never stingy. In fact, he often paid more than he had to. His reasoning was simple. He wanted to keep the young men from losing their will to work. He was also fond of giving advice. While sitting at the local diner with other town elders, he often spoke of the life philosophy he'd learned from his catfish. "A catfish is a tough old soul," he'd say. "Lives in the murky depths, but keeps on swimming. Never complains, even when its surroundings are less than perfect." If folks could learn that, we'd all be a little more resilient in hard times. These words were repeated so often they became local wisdom. Many young men felt motivated by them, holding onto that image as a reminder when facing their own struggles. In his modest brick house, Pops Moreau lived with his wife and 2 children. He was known as a loving family man who never raised his voice to his wife and always pushed his children to get the best education possible. For him, school was the way for the next generation to avoid the hard life he'd known in his youth. The Moreau family life seemed entirely normal. There were no signs of anything strange. When there was a town potluck, he always showed up with a cooler full of fried catfish. When someone passed away, he helped dig the grave. During the Christmas season, he donated generously to the church's toy drive for needy children. All this goodwill made it difficult for people to imagine that his ponds would one day become the site where dozens of bodies were discovered. For the young men of the town, working at Pops Moreau's catfish farm was a source of pride. They learned that hard work could yield real results. Caleb Boudreau was one of them. He often told his friends that Pops Moreau wasn't just a boss, but a life teacher. He vividly remembered one sweltering afternoon when he complained about being tired. Pops had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Son, if we only ever look for the easy way, life will always feel heavy. But if you face the hard work head-on, sooner or later, that burden starts to feel a little lighter." Everyone believed that Pops Moreau was a good man. He was a symbol of perseverance, living proof that a country boy could succeed without leaving his hometown. That's why, when a foul smell began to drift from his ponds, no one dared to accuse him of anything. They preferred to hold their noses and assume it was just the smell of stagnant mud. But silently, fate was preparing a terrible surprise. The ponds that had long been seen as a blessing and a source of livelihood were hiding a dark secret. A secret that would slowly drag Pops Moreau's name into a storm of suspicion. And the townspeople who had admired him for so long would soon be faced with a bitter truth they would find hard to accept. Since he was a boy, Caleb Boudreau had been accustomed to the fishy smell of the catfish ponds. To him, it wasn't something unpleasant, it was just part of the job. Every time he helped spread feed at Pops Moreau's farm, he could hold his breath and consider it just another part of his workday. But during one long, dry summer in 2023, he began to notice something different. That morning, as he carried a sack of feed to the edge of the pond, his nostrils were assaulted by a sickeningly sweet, rotten smell. It wasn't just the familiar odor of fish or mud baking under the hot sun. This was something sharper, more pungent, like the smell of an animal carcass that had been left in the water for too long. Caleb paused, pulling the collar of his t-shirt over his nose. A wave of nausea washed over him, and his legs felt unsteady. He tried to ignore it. He quickly scattered the pellets across the water's surface, expecting the usual frenzy of catfish to break the surface. But strangely, only a few fish emerged. Normally, hundreds of greedy catfish would churn the water, fighting over the feed. This time, the pond's surface only rippled slightly, then fell still again. Caleb stared, confused. Pops Moreau, who saw him from the porch of his small office, just gave a thin smile. He said it was normal. During a long drought, the ponds tended to smell a bit stronger. Once the rains came, it would all wash away. Caleb nodded, though a knot of doubt remained in his gut. He didn't want to be seen as a kid who asked too many questions. Besides, who would dare question Pops Morrow, the most respected man in town? In the following days, the smell grew worse. Whenever the wind blew from the direction of the ponds, residents living nearby felt dizzy. One woman complained of a persistent headache every afternoon. A father recounted how his son refused to walk down the road near the farm because he couldn't stand the smell. This became a frequent topic of conversation at the local diner. But whenever a complaint was voiced, there was always someone to defend Pops. "It's a fish farm. What do you expect?" "Of course it's gonna smell," the old-timers would say. Caleb grew more and more uneasy. Every time he spread the feed, he had to hold his breath for a long time. At night, when the wind carried the stench to his trailer, he would wake up feeling sick. He'd sit on the edge of his bed, staring at the ceiling. He had a bad feeling he couldn't articulate, but he chose to keep quiet, afraid of being accused of stirring up trouble. One afternoon, he sat at the diner, listening to the hushed conversations of the other patrons. A woman held a napkin to her nose and said, "Something just ain't right." A younger man even dared to whisper that maybe someone had dumped something in the pond. But the conversation died abruptly when Mayor Du Bois walked past the diner's front window. Everyone fell silent, pretending to be engrossed in their coffee. That night, Caleb was awakened again by a stench more overpowering than ever before. He went outside and stood in his yard, looking toward the ponds, which were shrouded in a thin mist. The single security light at the edge of the farm was dim, almost out. The chirp of crickets mingled with the rustle of the wind. But strangely, the night felt quieter than usual. A shiver ran down Caleb's spine, as if the entire town were holding its breath. He hugged himself, trying to calm his racing heart, but the bad feeling only intensified. There was something hiding in the murky water of that pond, something that couldn't be explained away by a long summer drought. In his heart, Caleb began to believe that the smell wasn't just mud. There was a huge secret buried beneath the surface. But he didn't dare say it to anyone. Everyone respected Pops Morrow too much. Who would believe that a kind-hearted farmer was hiding something in his ponds? Caleb could only keep his fear to himself, silent and alone. He didn't know that soon, his suspicions would be confirmed in the most horrifying way imaginable. That morning, the sun had just peeked over the low hills to the east of Beaureve. Dew still clung to the tips of the sawgrass, and the sound of roosters crowing echoed from every direction. Caleb Boudreaux walked slowly toward Pops Morrow's catfish ponds, a heavy sack of feed slung over his shoulder. His steps were heavy, not from the weight of the sack, but from the sense of dread that had been pressing on his chest since the night before. The rotten smell from the ponds had become unbearable. The previous evening, the wind had carried the putrid scent into his trailer, and he had thrown up his dinner. Hesitantly, he scattered the feed onto the water's surface. But strangely, only a handful of catfish appeared. The pond, usually churning with hungry fish, was eerily calm. The murky, brownish water seemed to be hiding something. Caleb called out for Pops Morrow, hoping the older man would emerge from the small office beside the ponds. But the door was shut tight. There was no answer, no sign of life. Feeling uneasy, Caleb sat on the grassy bank, staring at the surface of the water, which occasionally released a small bubble of gas. The stench was overwhelming. He covered his nose with his hand. Curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed a long PVC pipe that was used to stir the feed and slowly prodded the bottom of the pond, hoping to find an answer. When he pulled the pipe back up, something was stuck to the end. It was a piece of dark-colored fabric, soaked and foul-smelling. At first, he thought it was just a piece of trash, but when he pulled harder, the fabric felt attached to something heavy. Caleb's heart began to pound in his chest. He gripped the pipe with both hands, his body trembling. From the murky water, a shape slowly emerged that made his blood run cold. A human arm, blue and swollen and covered in mud, rose to the surface. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, his breath caught in his throat. With a hoarse cry, he stumbled backward, his body shaking uncontrollably. He couldn't bear to look at it again. He scrambled to his feet and ran as fast as he could toward the main road, his voice cracking as he screamed for help. "There's a body! There's a body in the catfish pond!" His shouts sent people pouring out of their houses. Some were still holding their morning coffee mugs, others ran out barefoot. A few grabbed their children by the hand. They all followed Caleb toward the pond. When they saw it with their own eyes, the scene erupted into chaos. An old man collapsed onto the ground, his face pale. A woman shrieked hysterically, covering her face with her apron. The news spread like a brushfire. Within minutes, dozens of people had gathered around the pond, pushing and shoving to get a look. A few brave young men waded into the shallow edge and pulled on the dark fabric. What they uncovered made everyone freeze. From the mud emerged the body of a young woman with long, tangled hair, her clothes in tatters, her skin a pale, greenish hue. The screaming started again. The crowd panicked. Several people fainted. Some wept, while others prayed ceaselessly. Then, someone shouted, "It's not just one. There are more." The townspeople worked together, using a small pump to drain the water from the pond. With every inch the water level dropped, a more gruesome sight was revealed. More bodies of women emerged from the muddy bottom. Some were still bound with ropes, some were badly decomposed, and others had nearly become one with the earth. The number kept growing. The residents could no longer count. They could only stare in horror at the scene before them. Within a few hours, it became clear that there weren't just one or two bodies, but dozens. Beau Rêve had turned into a sea of screams. Children were led away, forbidden to see. The men were busy trying to comfort their wives and neighbors, but the fear was too immense to contain. The whispers of voodoo and black magic began to circulate. There had long been stories of people who got rich through dark rituals, using human sacrifices. Now, Pops Moro's catfish farm was the subject of these dark accusations. Caleb himself sat limply under a live oak tree near the pond. His hands trembled, his eyes were vacant. The memory of that bloated, blue arm refused to leave him. He covered his face with his hands, trying to erase the horrific image. But it was useless. He knew his life and his town would never be the same again. The crowd at the edge of the pond grew more uncontrollable. Cries, screams, and terrified whispers mingled into a single, chaotic sound. Some were convinced it was the work of a cult. Others accused Pops Moro outright. Some just stood there, pale and silent. In the midst of the chaos, a loud voice suddenly cut through the noise. "Everyone, please calm down. Let's not jump to conclusions. We will leave this to the authorities." The voice belonged to Leland Dubois, the mayor of Beau Rêve. He had arrived with a few other town officials, dressed in a crisp white shirt and khaki pants, looking as though he had just come from a morning meeting. Mayor Dubois was known for his friendly and generous nature. In his 2 terms as mayor, he had always been present for his community. He helped with school fees for underprivileged children, contributed to road repairs, and even lent a hand during the harvest. For these reasons, many people called him the town father. His presence at the catfish pond seemed to bring a semblance of order, at least for those who trusted him. But this time, though his voice was firm, his face was pale, and his eyes held a flicker of something he couldn't hide in front of the crowd. He stood at the edge of the pond, trying to quell the whispers that had already turned into accusations. "Folks of Beau Rêve, let's not let suspicion divide us. We all know Pops Moro. He's a good man, a hard worker. It's impossible that he would do something like this." A few people nodded in agreement, calmed by his words. But others remained skeptical, their hushed whispers continuing in the background. Someone muttered that even good people can change. Another told their neighbor to be quiet, afraid of offending the mayor. Dubois then walked over to Caleb, who was still sitting trembling under the oak tree. He placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Caleb, calm yourself. You did the right thing by telling everyone. Now, let the police do their work. His words sounded reassuring, but Caleb felt something strange. The mayor's gaze was intensely sharp, as if he were trying to ascertain something. Before long, deputies from the local sheriff's department arrived. The yellow police tape was extended, and the crowd was pushed back. A few officers began documenting the scene at the pond, while the townspeople could only watch from a distance. The chaos slowly subsided into an organized, albeit tense scene. Though fear still hung heavy in the air, the arrival of local news crews brought a new kind of energy. Cameras focused on the panicked faces of the residents, the weeping mothers, and, of course, the pond filled with mud and bodies. The headline quickly spread: 39 female bodies found in Louisiana catfish pond. Beau Rêve, a town that had rarely been mentioned in the news, was suddenly the center of national attention. Amidst the crowd of reporters, Mayor Du Bois stood tall, answering questions in a firm tone. We will cooperate fully with the police. The town of Beau Rêve will find the truth. He tried to maintain the image of a strong, capable leader. But behind his calm demeanor, a few observant townspeople noticed something was off. That night, as the initial shock began to wear off, Du Bois walked through the town's quiet streets. He greeted residents who were still sitting on their porches, reassuring them not to be afraid. But whispers followed in his wake. Some said he was too calm. Others praised his steady leadership. No one dared to speak their thoughts aloud. They only harbored their suspicions in their hearts. To most of the residents, Du Bois was still the respected mayor. But for a few, new questions began to arise. Why had he arrived at the scene so quickly, as if he already knew what had happened? And why did his face look so pale when he saw the bodies being pulled from the mud? These questions hung in the air unanswered. But one thing was certain: that night, all the residents realized that the peace of their town had been shattered. And even though Mayor Du Bois tried to calm them, the horrifying image from the bottom of the pond could not be easily erased. That day, Beau Rêve was overrun. The small dirt roads, usually traveled only by local farmers or children on bicycles, were now choked with police cruisers, news vans, and crowds of whispering onlookers. The modest town hall was transformed into a temporary command post. Its wooden tables were covered with paperwork, crime scene photos, and police equipment. The yellow tape around the catfish farm became a stark boundary between two worlds. Inside, forensic teams worked tirelessly, lifting body bags one by one and loading them into ambulances. Outside, the residents watched with pale faces, some weeping, others staring into space. The stench of decay mixed with mud still hung in the air, amplifying the horror. Local and national media descended on the town. Large cameras were pointed at the pond. Microphones were thrust in front of the faces of hysterical residents. Reporters competed for the most dramatic story. A young journalist even broadcast live from the edge of the pond, his voice trembling as he declared this the largest discovery of its kind in Louisiana's criminal history. The state police were quickly called in. Among them, a young detective named Ethan Hayes was assigned to lead the initial investigation. He was only in his 30s, but his reputation preceded him. He was known for being tough, persistent, and successful in solving difficult cases. When his unmarked sedan pulled up in front of the town hall, all eyes turned to him. There was a sense of hope on the residents' faces, as if his arrival alone could provide answers. Hayes stepped out of the car with a steady gait. Mayor Du Bois immediately greeted him, shaking his hand firmly. "Welcome, detective. Our town is counting on your help." His words were warm, but his eyes held a nervous tremor. Hayes stared at him for a moment, as if trying to read the man's soul, then gave a curt nod. "We'll do our best. I expect full cooperation and no holding back information." When he arrived at the pond, Hayes fell silent. Before him lay a pit of murky sludge, half-drained. Soaked pieces of fabric were still visible, along with parts of bodies that had not yet been recovered. The foul smell penetrated the mask he wore. He was used to seeing crime victims, but a number this large made his chest ache. At the edge of the pond, He saw a young man sitting in a daze, his face pale, his eyes empty. Hayes asked a bystander who he was, and a woman replied, "That's Caleb, the boy who found the first body." Hayes approached and sat down next to him. "Tell me everything from the beginning, son. Don't leave anything out." With a trembling voice, Caleb recounted how he had found the black cloth that was attached to a human arm. His words were halting, but his sincerity was palpable. Hayes listened intently, then gently patted his shoulder. In his gut, he knew this kid wasn't a perpetrator, but a victim of a trauma that would take a long time to heal. Meanwhile, the town grew even more crowded. Reporters roamed around, digging for information. Some even tried to sneak past the police line. The residents huddled in the local diner, exchanging stories and theories. Some were convinced it was a series of murders, others insisted it was some kind of dark ritual. The once quiet town had become a macabre stage where everyone waited for answers. At the town hall, a large whiteboard was set up. The names of victims began to be listed as identifications were made. Police were busy cross-referencing missing persons reports from previous years. Files piled up, documents scattered everywhere. It all pointed to the fact that this tragedy wasn't a recent event, but a long chain of crimes that had been hidden for years. Night fell, but the town remained bustling. Floodlights were set up around the pond. Officers stood guard in rotating shifts. Reporters were still lurking, hoping for a new development. Residents sat on their porches, speaking in low tones, afraid of being overheard by strangers. Children couldn't sleep, asking innocently if ghosts would come out of the pond. Their parents could only stroke their heads, not knowing what to say. From that day on, Beau Rêve was no longer a simple, slow-paced town. It had become the focus of the entire nation. But behind the media frenzy and public scrutiny, a much darker secret was waiting to be unveiled. And Detective Ethan Hayes, the young investigator who had just arrived, had no idea that this case would pull him deeper into the darkness than he had ever imagined. That afternoon, the sun hung low in the western sky, painting the Louisiana horizon a pale orange. At the edge of the catfish pond, the forensics team was still painstakingly removing the bodies, one by one. The black bags were lined up on the dirt road, each marked with a number in white chalk for identification. The townspeople watched from a distance, some covering their faces, others praying softly with tear-filled eyes. Ethan Hayes stood just outside the police tape, his gaze fixed on the row of body bags. A strange feeling stirred within him, something he couldn't explain. His instincts urged him to step closer, as if something over there were calling to him. One of the body bags had not yet been loaded into the ambulance. Hayes asked for permission to see it. The officer hesitated, but Hayes insisted. With a trembling hand, he slowly pulled down the zipper. The stench of decay hit him like a physical blow, but he forced himself to look. The face before him made his blood run cold. It was a woman in her 40s. Her long hair was tangled and matted with mud, her features distorted by decomposition. But the lines of her face were hauntingly familiar. Hayes staggered back, his chest tightening, his eyes burning. The world seemed to stop. In a whisper so faint it was barely audible, he breathed a single word, "Mom." The officer standing beside him looked at him with concern, asking if he knew the victim. Hayes took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to control the turmoil inside him. He nodded slowly. She looks just like my mother, Eleanor. She disappeared 20 years ago." A sudden silence fell over the immediate area. The other officers looked at Hayes with a mixture of sympathy and shock. No one could have imagined that the detective sent from the city would find his own mother among the victims. Memories of his childhood flooded his mind. He saw himself as a small boy, sitting on the front porch, waiting for his mother to come home from the market. But that day, she never returned. The neighbors said she had probably run off, maybe started a new life somewhere else. Over time, everyone forgot, but the wound in Ethan's heart never truly healed. Now, after 2 decades, the answer had appeared in the most brutal way possible. His mother hadn't left. She had been a victim, buried with dozens of other women at the bottom of a filthy pond. Hayes zipped the body bag shut. A tear escaped and rolled down his cheek, but his voice was firm, though trembling when he spoke. No matter what, I will continue to do my job professionally. But from this moment on, this case is also personal. That night, with a sliver of a moon hanging dimly in the sky, Hayes stood alone at the edge of the pond. The foul smell still stung his nostrils, but he didn't move. He stared into the dark mud that had just given up its secret. In a hoarse voice, he whispered, "Mom, I promise I will find who did this to you, and I will make them pay." The night wind rustled the leaves of the cypress trees, and the small town of Beau Rêve seemed to hold its breath, as if listening to a son's vow to his mother. But behind that silence, a great storm was brewing, a storm that would drag Ethan Hayes into a conspiracy darker than anything he had ever imagined. Since the night he found his mother's face among the victims, Ethan Hayes had barely slept. The town hall, now a command post, was filled with stacks of files. Missing persons reports from various parishes had been collected, their pages covering every wooden table. Hayes sat with a tense expression, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but his hand never stopped marking each record with a red pen. A pattern was emerging. Most of the victims came from low-income families. They had no known enemies, no significant debts, and no assets that would make them a target for robbery. But they all disappeared in a similar manner. They were last seen near a bus station, a local market, or on a quiet road at the edge of town. After that, they vanished without a trace. Hayes stared at the old case files, his brow furrowed. Many of the reports, written years ago, had never been followed up on. Some were merely stamped as received and then filed away. Others were listed as missing persons cases, but were never actively investigated. It was as if an invisible hand had deliberately allowed these cases to fade into obscurity. He slammed his fist on the table. How could so many reports be ignored? He muttered, his voice low but filled with anger. His partner looked over, trying to calm him. Maybe the old guard thought these women just ran off or moved away. Hayes shook his head vehemently. No, there are too many. Dozens of people disappearing in the same way, and all the trails lead here, to this town. That night, he left the command post and walked toward the pond, now just a half-filled pit of mud. The pale moonlight reflected off the murky water. The lingering stench made his chest feel tight. He stood there for a long time, clutching a worn photograph of his mother that he kept in his wallet. "Mom," he whispered, "it turns out you didn't leave. You were a victim of a crime that was deliberately covered up. I promise I will uncover everything." As he stood there, a young man approached him. It was Caleb, the one who had found the first body. His face was pale, but his eyes were determined. "Detective Hayes, I remember something," he said quietly. "A few nights before the smell got real bad, I saw a big 18-wheeler coming into town. It always came at night, never during the day." Hayes looked at him sharply. "Do you know who the truck belonged to?" Caleb shook his head. "No, sir. But I once saw the driver talking to one of Mayor Dubois's men." That name sent a chill down Hayes' spine. The mayor, so respected by the townspeople, the so-called town father, had a dark shadow looming behind him. He put a hand on Caleb's shoulder and told the young man not to tell anyone else what he'd seen. This could be dangerous, he warned. From that night on, Hayes' suspicion solidified. This case wasn't just about murder or the disposal of bodies. There was a larger network at play, and influential people were intentionally covering it up. They might be all around him, perhaps even the people he spoke to every day. Hayes closed his notebook with a snap. His eyes burned with determination. From now on, he wasn't just dealing with ordinary criminals. He was facing a deep-rooted conspiracy that could destroy anyone who dared to uncover it. The air in Beau Rêve felt suffocating that night. A slow wind carried the sound of rustling sawgrass, adding to the silence. Hayes sat in his unmarked car, watching the deserted town road. His eyes were heavy with fatigue, but his mind wouldn't rest. Caleb's words about the large truck echoed in his thoughts, a truck that came and went in secret, under the cover of darkness. Around midnight, the faint glow of headlights appeared from the direction of the main highway. Hayes immediately started his engine, but kept his own lights off, maintaining a safe distance. From afar, he saw a gray, unmarked 18-wheeler turn slowly onto the parish road. Its headlights were dimmed, making it nearly invisible to a casual observer. The truck stopped briefly near an old, abandoned warehouse. The building was covered in moss, its roof sagging, and it had been empty for years. But that night, two men got out of the truck's cab and opened the rear trailer door. From behind the shadows, Hayes watched intently. He heard the clang of metal and then, faintly, the sound of a muffled cry. Hayes's blood ran cold. There were still living victims. But before he could get closer, one of the men quickly shut the door. The truck started moving again, heading out of town. Hayes immediately followed, keeping his distance. However, a few hundred yards down the road, a motorcycle with two men in dark helmets appeared from behind him. They revved their engine loudly, as if deliberately announcing their presence. Hayes realized he was being watched. If he continued to follow the truck, his cover would be blown. With a heavy heart, he pulled over, turned off his engine, and watched the truck disappear around a bend. His chest burned with anger. The chance to rescue a victim had just slipped through his fingers. But that night, his conviction grew stronger. The discovery of the bodies in the pond wasn't about some local superstition, as the townspeople whispered. It was clearly a human trafficking network. Young women were being kidnapped, some sold, others disposed of when they were no longer considered useful. And Beau Rêve was being used as their dumping ground. The next morning, Hayes called Caleb to the command post. The young man arrived with a pale face, still visibly traumatized. Hayes looked at him intently. "Caleb, are you sure you saw the truck driver talking to someone from the town?" Caleb nodded firmly, though his body trembled. "I don't know his name, but I've seen him sitting on the porch of the town hall with one of Mayor Dubois's assistants." Hayes let out a long breath. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit. The name of the mayor, who had been so revered by the community, kept coming up. But as a detective, he knew he couldn't be reckless. He needed hard evidence, witnesses, and a confession that couldn't be refuted. That night, Hayes wrote in his small notebook. He noted the gray 18-wheeler, the old warehouse, the sound of crying, and the possible involvement of someone inside the town's administration. His hand trembled, but his writing was clear. In his mind, he whispered, "I can't afford to be careless." Every move could mean someone's life. Outside, the town's stray dogs barked into the night, as if they, too, could feel the tension in the air. Hayes looked up at the cloudy night sky. He knew one thing for sure. The hunt had just begun, and that gray truck was the key to unlocking the dark secret that had been hidden for so long. In the days that followed, Beau Rêve was no longer quiet. Every corner of the town was filled with whispers. Some still believed it was all due to some dark, supernatural curse. Others were beginning to sense that there was a real, human evil behind the mystery. But for Hayes, his belief was solid. He had seen the truck carrying people with his own eyes. He had heard the muffled cries from inside the trailer. This wasn't a ghost story, it was a living nightmare. At the command post, the pile of missing persons reports continued to grow. The forensics team also began to find matches between the identities of the victims in the pond and the existing reports. One by one, the names became clear. Most were young women from simple backgrounds. They weren't wealthy or influential, just small-town girls who had never come home. Hayes stared at the large map on the wall of the command post. He drew lines with a red marker connecting the locations where the victims had disappeared. The lines converged in one large circle, right around Beau Rêve. The more he stared at it, the clearer it became that this town was the final stop on a dark journey. That afternoon, Hayes sat with two of his colleagues who had come from the state police headquarters. They were discussing the progress of the investigation. One of his colleagues asked, "Is it possible this really is some kind of ritualistic thing?" Hayes looked at him for a long moment and then answered in a firm voice. No. I've seen it myself. There's a truck, there are armed men, and there are victims who are still alive. This isn't about the supernatural. This is human trafficking. Those words made the air in the room feel heavy. Everyone fell silent, realizing the magnitude of the network they were up against. If this was a human trafficking syndicate, then the perpetrators couldn't be small-time criminals. There was big money involved, logistics, and protection from certain authorities. That night, Hayes stood at the edge of a field overlooking the catfish pond. The wind carried a faint, lingering stench of decay. He stared at the mud for a long time, as if he were speaking to the mother who lay buried within it. "Mom," he whispered, "it turns out this wasn't anything mystical. The ones who did this were human. Greedy men who sell the lives of others for money. I promise I will expose them all." Not far from him, Caleb approached with a worried look on his face. "Sir, I hear some of the townspeople still believe this is a curse. They're getting scared and don't want to talk." Hayes patted the young man's shoulder. "Don't worry. The truth will come out. I've seen enough evidence." From that moment on, Hayes became even more focused. He re-examined the town's financial records, construction reports, and even the activities of companies in the surrounding parishes. Everything that looked clean on the surface, he suspected was a front. The deeper he dug, the more convinced he became that this network was vast, well-organized, and protected by people who were supposed to be protecting the public. As night fell, Hayes opened his notebook again. In it, he wrote firmly, "This case is not about a curse. This case is human trafficking, involving powerful people and a lot of money." He closed the book with a snap. His eyes gazed into the darkness of the town. Behind the sound of the crickets, he knew there were secret footsteps watching him. But he was not afraid. His resolve was set. From that night on, he was no longer investigating a local mystery. He was dismantling a vicious human trafficking syndicate that hid behind the friendly face of a small town. That morning, the sky over southern Louisiana was overcast, the low gray clouds seeming to add to the weight on Ethan Hayes' shoulders. At the town hall, now a makeshift command post, he sat at a wooden table piled high with files. His face was weary, his eyes red, but his mind was racing. Something had been bothering him ever since Caleb mentioned seeing the truck driver talking to one of Mayor Dubois's men. Mayor Dubois was known for his friendly, smiling demeanor. He had led Beaureve for 2 terms, and the residents called him the town father. He was the man who was always present at every town event, who helped during the harvest, and who often donated to the local school. No one had ever suspected him. But it was precisely for that reason that Hayes felt so uneasy. Someone who appeared too perfect in the public eye often had a dark side they kept hidden. That afternoon, Hayes decided to visit the town office. He wanted to speak with Mayor Dubois directly. When he walked in, the mayor greeted him warmly, smiling as usual. "Detective Hayes, I am so deeply concerned about this whole affair. Our quiet town's name has been tarnished. I urge you to catch whoever is responsible as soon as possible." Hayes nodded, studying the man's every move. The smile seemed genuine, but there was a tension in the lines of his face, as if he were hiding something. Hayes deliberately pressed further. "Mr. Mayor, have you ever noticed any large trucks coming in and out of town late at night?" Mayor Dubois paused for a fraction of a second before answering, I can't say that I have. It's probably just merchants from out of town passing through." The answer was too quick, too dismissive. Hayes made a mental note. His instincts told him there was a lie behind that friendly smile. That night, Hayes wrote in his small notebook again. He wrote Mayor Dubois's name in bold letters. Underneath it, he drew a large question mark. He knew that accusing a respected mayor without solid proof was a fatal mistake. However, the pieces of information were all pointing in one direction. The suspicious flow of money, the mysterious truck, and the townspeople who were too afraid to talk, all these trails seemed to encircle the figure of Mayor Dubois. A few days later, an elderly resident came to the command post in secret. His face was anxious, his voice trembling. "Detective," he began, "I once saw the mayor meeting with two strange men on the road near the fields. The meeting was brief, but it clearly wasn't a casual chat. I didn't dare tell anyone." Hayes looked at the old man seriously and thanked him for the small act of courage he had shown. After the man left, Hayes was more convinced than ever. Mayor Dubois didn't just know something. He was likely part of the dark circle that had been casting a shadow over the town for years. That night, Hayes stood for a long time in front of his investigation board. Mayor Dubois's name was now on the same level as another name he had been investigating, a wealthy businessman named Marcus Thorne, who had a dark history in Houston. He stared at the two names and clenched his fists. If the two were connected, then he was dealing with a network far larger than a simple murder case. Outside, rain began to fall softly, wetting the dry earth. The sound of water dripping on the roof of the town hall made the atmosphere even more somber. Hayes closed his eyes for a moment and whispered, "Mom, it's becoming clearer now. The man this town respects might be the mastermind behind all this suffering." The air in southern Louisiana felt scorchingly hot that day. The sun beat down on Beau Reve, turning the dirt roads dusty and dry. Inside the command post, Hayes sat with a furrowed brow. In front of him was a brown file containing new documents sent by the state police intelligence team. His heart pounded as he flipped through the pages. The file detailed financial transactions from several town officials, including Mayor Dubois's personal bank account. Hayes read carefully. Large figures were printed in black and white. The amounts far exceeded a small-town mayor's salary. Every 3 months, there was a deposit of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The more he read, the more his suspicion turned into certainty. Even more shocking, the money was traced back to an account belonging to Marcus Thorne, a wealthy businessman in Houston who had long been known for his slick dealings. He had been implicated in gambling and fraud cases, but had always managed to evade the law. The name was not unfamiliar to Hayes. He knew how powerful Thorne's influence was and how difficult it would be to take him down without irrefutable proof. Hayes gripped the documents, his hands trembling. There was a direct connection between Mayor Dubois and Marcus Thorne. For years, the townspeople believed their mayor was a generous man, but in reality, he was receiving dark money from a major criminal. That afternoon, Hayes tried to act normal. He paid a visit to Mayor Dubois's house, which was significantly grander than the other homes in town. The mayor greeted him with a friendly smile, invited him in, and served him a glass of iced tea. His voice was soft, as if he were genuinely concerned about the investigation. Hayes just smiled thinly, hiding his true feelings. Every word that came out of Mayor Dubois's mouth sounded sweet, but to Hayes, it was all a mask. After the meeting, Hayes wrote a critical note in his book. Dubois received large sums of money from Thorne. The money came in regularly and was mostly disguised as funding for town development projects. But the amounts were too large to be plausible for just roads or a town hall. That night, Hayes sat lost in thought on the porch of the command post. The sound of crickets filled the air, and an oil lamp swayed in the breeze. He reopened the financial report and stared at Marcus Thorne's name for a long time. If this was indeed money to cover up human trafficking, then this network didn't just involve people from the town, but also a powerful businessman with extensive connections. Before long, Caleb brought him a cup of coffee. The young man's face was worried. "Detective Hayes, I hear the residents are getting restless. Some still believe this is a curse, but others are starting to suspect that important people in town are involved." Hayes looked at him meaningfully. "Let them talk. The more people who are suspicious, the harder it will be for the perpetrators to hide." He took a slow sip of the hot coffee. In his heart, he knew that his next steps would be extremely dangerous. Going after big names like Marcus Thorne and Mayor Dubois meant provoking people with money, power, and influence. But he also knew that without that courage, there would be no justice. Hayes closed the brown file and looked out at the dark, silent fields. Tonight, he made a promise to himself. That dark money trail would be the key to unlocking the massive door that had been sealed shut for so long. That night, the sky over southern Louisiana was dark and moonless. Ethan Hayes drove down a narrow road toward a freight station, wearing a simple black jacket instead of his uniform. He was intentionally in disguise to avoid attracting attention. In his pocket, a small camera was ready to be used. According to the information he had received, the old warehouse near the station was often used by Thorne to cover up his illegal businesses. When he reached the location, Hayes parked his rented motorcycle behind a stack of shipping containers. From a distance, he could see several luxury cars parked nearby. The warehouse lights were dim but bright enough to reveal activity inside. Several men in sharp suits were moving back and forth, carrying black briefcases. Their movements were quick and organized, as if they were well-trained. Hayes crept closer, holding his breath behind the warehouse wall where the paint was peeling. He took out his small camera and started recording. Suddenly, a black sedan pulled up to the entrance. A large, imposing man with neatly slicked-back hair stepped out. Hayes recognized him immediately. It was Marcus Thorne. But what made his heart pound was the figure who emerged beside him, Mayor Leland Dubois. The two men shook hands firmly, shared a small laugh, and went inside the warehouse. Cold sweat dripped down Hayes's back. All his suspicions were correct. The two men were working together. He moved to the side of the warehouse where the wall was cracked. Through a small gap, he could overhear parts of their conversation. Thorne's deep voice was clear. "The numbers are all correct. The ship is ready to leave next week. If there are no problems, all the goods will reach their destination." Dubois replied in a calm tone, "Good. My town is secure. The people trust me. No one suspects a thing. That pond can't be used anymore, of course. We'll find another place." Hayes gripped the camera in his hand tightly. The word goods was clearly not referring to inanimate objects, but to human beings. The sentence about the pond made all the pieces of the puzzle fall into place. The catfish farm was just a convenient disposal site for victims who were no longer useful. But then another voice spoke, low but firm. "There's a cop who's starting to sniff around. His name is Ethan Hayes." Hayes flinched. His name had been mentioned. Thorne replied coldly, "Let him. If he gets too close, we'll get rid of him." Hayes's heart hammered against his ribs. He backed away slowly, afraid the sound of his own breathing would give him away. Cold sweat poured down his face, his hands trembled. That night, he knew he was playing with fire. One wrong move, and his life could be over before he could expose all the secrets. He quickly returned to his motorcycle, started it quietly, and left the area without a trace. When he got back to the command post, he wrote down every detail in his notebook. He had recorded part of the direct meeting between Dubois and Thorne with his camera. It was golden evidence, though still risky without corroborating witnesses and data. Hayes sat for a long time, staring at the investigation board full of red lines. Now everything was clearer. Beau Reve was just a small stage for a grand drama of human trafficking, controlled by powerful men. And he, a young detective, was already in too deep to turn back. That night, Beau Reve was no longer silent. The main road was filled with restless townspeople. Some carried torches, others gripped makeshift weapons like baseball bats and pieces of bamboo. They had heard that Thorne's and Mayor Dubois's men were gathering at the town hall. A bonfire blazed, casting the flickering shadows of their tense faces onto the surrounding buildings. Hayes stood before the crowd, flanked by his partner from the state police and Caleb, the young man who had found the first body. Their faces were etched with determination, despite their exhaustion. Hayes knew this night would be the deciding moment. He looked at the townspeople one by one and spoke in a loud, clear voice. "Our time for silence is over. The catfish pond, the warehouse, and all the victims buried in the mud are proof that this evil is real. The perpetrators are not ghosts or spirits, they are men you see every day." A low cheer rippled through the crowd. Some residents looked around, drawing courage from their neighbors' eyes. Before long, a black sedan pulled up in front of the town hall. Marcus Thorne stepped out, dressed in an expensive suit, an arrogant smirk on his face. Beside him, Mayor Dubois stood with a stoic expression, trying to maintain his image as a respected leader. Thorne strode forward, clapping his hands together. "Quite a show you've put on," he said loudly. "But don't forget, I have money. And with money, I can buy anything, including your lives." Hayes took a step forward. "Money can't always wash away blood. We have a recording of your meeting with Dubois at the warehouse. Your voice is clear, your plan is on tape." The crowd began to murmur loudly. Dubois tried to defend himself, shouting that it was all lies. But suddenly Mrs. Gable, a woman who had lost her daughter years ago, stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Then why did my daughter disappear after she was last seen with your men, Mr. Mayor? Why did you just tell us to be quiet every time we asked?" One by one, other residents began to speak up. The whispers that had been suppressed by fear erupted into a chorus of accusations. All the stories that had been swallowed in silence now came pouring out. Dubois's face turned pale, his eyes darted around, looking for an escape. Suddenly, Thorne signaled to his men, who brandished firearms. The atmosphere grew tense. The crowd stepped back, but Hayes raised a hand, signaling for them to hold their ground. In a firm voice, he said, "Tonight is not just about evidence. It's about our courage to protect our town. If we back down now, our children will continue to be victims." A clash erupted. The sound of wood hitting flesh, rocks flying through the air, and a gunshot shattering the night filled the air. Flames from a torch caught a pile of hay, and the fire grew, turning the town square into a battleground. Hayes fought with one of Thorne's henchmen, parrying blows with a sturdy piece of wood. His partner protected the residents, firing a warning shot into the air. Caleb, though young and terrified, ran to help a fallen resident, dragging an old man to safety before returning to the fray with a look of defiance. "Don't be afraid. There are more of us than them," he shouted, his voice igniting the crowd's spirit. Amidst the chaos, the sound of sirens suddenly pierced the night. Red and blue lights cut through the darkness. Dozens of state police officers arrived in tactical vehicles. Thorne's men panicked. Some surrendered, others tried to flee but were quickly apprehended. Thorne made a run for his car, but Hayes blocked his path, his pistol aimed squarely at him. "Your journey ends here." Thorne sneered, still trying to project an air of arrogance. "You think you've won? My money can get me out of any prison." Hayes looked at him coldly. "Not this time. Besides the evidence of your crimes, there's one victim who means more to me than any other. My mother." Thorne fell silent. The police swiftly handcuffed him. Dubois was dragged away by the townspeople, his face bruised and beaten. No one believed his friendly smile anymore. As dawn broke, thin wisps of smoke still rose from the embers of the fire. Beau Reve looked weary, but for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope. The residents stood together, watching the two men they had feared being led into police vehicles. A cheer of victory erupted, not because the fight was over, but because courage had finally triumphed over fear. Hayes stood at the side of the road, looking at the brightening sky. In his hand, he clutched the worn photograph of his mother. A tear rolled slowly down his cheek, no longer a tear of sorrow, but of relief. "Mom," he whispered, "your struggle was not in vain. I've found the truth." He turned to the assembled crowd, his voice calm and full of meaning. "Remember this. Evil can hide behind a smile, but nothing is stronger than the courage to speak the truth." That day, Beau Reve